Welcome to the Fulbright Transatlantic Roundtable. We will begin in just a minute. A warm welcome to everyone from a very sunny day in Helsinki. I'm Lisa Weimer, the Assistant Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives at the Fulbright Finland Foundation. Before we get started, we would like to point out a few technical features of the webinar. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A box. As the panel speakers make their introductory remarks, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. Please take a moment now to find the Q&A box and click on it. There you will see the box that you can type in the questions. The questions you submit will be used during the discussion after all of the panel speakers have made their introductory remarks. I will give more technical instructions when we get to the Q&A discussion. Also, we want to encourage all participants to visit the webpage for this event, as we have added some background material such as reports and surveys that the speakers will be referring to that inform this roundtable discussion. And now I would like to give the floor to the CEO of the Fulbright Finland Foundation, Terhi Mosa, to give a welcome and introduction.
Thank you, Lisa. And welcome to today's Fulbright Transatlantic Roundtable. Our theme today is Reimagining Strategy. So my name is Terhi Mosa and I'm the CEO of the Fulbright Finland Foundation. The Fulbright Transatlantic Roundtable series addresses current questions and challenges in transatlantic exchanges and collaboration. These discussions bring together thought leaders and experts in our field to discuss and debate and to provide insights to develop better practice and support strategic planning. Today's topic addresses the impacts of the current pandemic. While COVID-19 reshapes higher education, how should international exchanges navigate the new normal? I want to welcome all our roundtable participants. We have incredible expertise here today, and I want to thank you for joining us from across multiple time zones for this important conversation. We will begin with an expert panel that will open up the roundtable with introductory statements, each focusing on a specific angle to our topic. And after the four panelists have had a chance to speak, all participants can join in the conversation with the questions and comments. This 1.5-hour discussion is an invitation-only event, but the recording will be made public after the event on the Roundtable's website. The purpose of the Roundtable is discussion, so I want us to get started as fast as possible. So I would now like to introduce our expert panel to begin the conversation. They're all very well known in our field, and their accomplishments would be far too vast to list here. So I simply want to refer to their bios that we have shared on the Roundtable website. I am tremendously grateful to them for sharing their insights and experience with us here today. In addition, I want to give them a special thank you for their continuous collaboration and association with our foundation. I'm privileged to work with all of them. A very warm welcome to Dr. Alan Goodman, President and CEO, Institute of International Education. Dr. John Lucas, President and CEO, International Student Exchange Programs, Icep. Dr. Julie Taylor, Director of Academic Relations for Fulbright Institute of International Education, and Birgitta Vuorinen, Deputy Director General, Finnish Ministry of Education and Culture. Thank you so much for being with us today. We will start with Dr. Alan Goodman, who leads the Institute of International Education. And it is interesting to note that when IIE started its work in international education and exchanges in just over 100 years ago, that was in the midst of the Spanish influenza pandemic. In view of how our field has evolved through previous major crises, is there wisdom that we can draw from the past as we try to prepare for the future? And what should we particularly pay attention to? Alan, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Terry. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. I see that I have to send you a more current pictures since none of us will ever wear ties again. But I'm really glad to be with you. I always appreciate Fulbright Finland convenings. I always learn from them, and especially when Terry makes an assignment, I always learn from the preparation. Speaking of assignments, my focus is to be on the aftermath, and I tried to reflect and think about what the aftermath would look like by not saying anything that appears in our daily newspapers or the widespread commentary about the COVID-19 outbreak, because I think it's important to take a longer term perspective and also to be thinking more deeply about the future than current commentary. I do so from the IIE particular vantage point. We were founded in the middle of a pandemic. This is actually our 12th pandemic in 101 years. Leads me to make 3 observations that I think are not made commonly enough as we are talking about the outbreak. The first is that pandemics end, and increasingly they do so thanks to international scientific cooperation, which makes academic mobility in research, technology, and application even more important today than maybe it's ever been in the past. And we have a role to play because international scientific cooperation will lead to the life-saving vaccine for this pandemic and for the ones ahead. The second observation is that when pandemics do end, all of our experience suggests that academic mobility rapidly resumes and substantially grows. And every indication available to us today from the field suggests that the same will be true for the post-COVID-19 new normal. There are record applications for Fulbright, for a wide variety of study abroad programs, for even this fall and certainly for next spring. And academic mobility will certainly continue to be on the horizon and highly important and successful for those institutions that have established relationships. So I do expect when the pandemic is declared over, you will see growth in international student enrollments and growth in study abroad programs. And this has not diminished one bit the desire of students and researchers to be part of academic mobility in a post-COVID world. Third, the post-COVID-19 world may reveal a more level playing field among all the major destination countries. And this may be a little bit different from any other pandemic experience in the past, where when mobility resumed and study abroad resumed, it tended to be in a few countries or in a one-way direction. And I think we may be looking at a world where the 15 major destination countries will all experience the same increases and the same challenges to sustaining them. As we hold this webinar, all the destination countries had outbreaks. All face and fear resurgence. All the destination countries face a complex and possibly uncertain fall semester or term. all will depend on local health conditions and regulations and where the universities, the schools are situated. And all will need air services to resume and country consulates to open. And that, in a sense, means we're all facing similar challenges. We're all facing similar problems and all facing similar uncertainties and complexities. If I could conclude with some practical advice, I'd like to ask Lisa to show two proverbs, two Finnish proverbs, which I think have a lot of resonance for us today in the situation we face today and the situation we'll face tomorrow. The first calls attention to the fact that we're probably still in the evening, not the morning, of getting out of this crisis. And we will make better decisions and take away better lessons in the morning than we are right now. But it's really important to begin documenting right now best practices, lessons, strategies, strategic options for the future, so that we're prepared for coming out of the crisis and we're prepared for getting ready for the next one, whenever that outbreak may occur. So I think we have a lot of lesson learning still ahead of us, but when the morning comes, when the pandemic is over, we will be infinitely better situated to deal with both the post-COVID world and reality, and also a world and reality where there will be other pandemics. The second proverb points up the fact that sometimes in emergencies and necessities, we are able to find the way. If anything, the lesson of these 6-8 months so far is a lesson that we are flexible, that we're resilient, and that universities and institutions of higher education in particular have to think through their foreign policies, where they want to be active in the world, how they want to reach out to the world, and what their expectations are for mobility between where they are and the world they'd like to share and be part of. And I think in the morning, in the aftermath of this crisis, we will have a rethink of institutional foreign policies, and that is a very healthy and also a very strategic way to approach the future. Terhi and Finland, Fulbright, thank you so much for this opportunity to offer some initial remarks.
Thank you so much, Alan, for your excellent insights, as always. To start our roundtable, Alan knows there is a Finnish saying for every purpose, and then we do hope that aamu on iltaa viisaampia ja hätä keinon keksii. Thank you again, Alan. We now go to our next panelist. He's Dr. John Lucas, President and CEO of Icep, an organization that actually played a large role also in my own decision to enter the field of international higher education exchanges a long time ago. John, most of the institutions and organizations in our field have never experienced anything near this scale and scope of challenge. Many are wondering if COVID-19 means the end of international education as we know it. We're looking to you to find out, how do we future-proof global partnerships? John, the microphone is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Terhi, and our colleagues at Fulbright Finland for hosting us, and Alan for starting us off. We all always look to IIE to help guide us, particularly their wonderful research capabilities and their long-term view. So Icep is one of the largest communities of over 360 colleges and universities in over 60 countries dedicated to international student mobility. I like to say that Icep is a global organization that happens to be in the United States rather than a US organization. 25% of our exchanges occur between countries outside the United States. So we have a somewhat different perspective. We are actually able to mobilize even in cases when the United States isn't, for example. So the next slide. Like all of us, we're finding this gap, right? Everything has shut down. And we're looking to the other side. And as Alan said, we know there's going to be another side. The question is, how long is the gap? How wide is the gap? And the second question is, what does it look like on the other side? And there are a lot of people saying, well, you know, international education exchange as we know it is over and things are going to be different forever. You know, so the question, will our fear eclipse our curiosity? Are we going to be online forever? These are the kind of things I hear in some of the other webinars. And if you go to the next slide, do we have to accept this new normal forever? When can we move from staying home to staying safe, but mobilizing again? And like Alan, I am an optimist. We may face a second wave of COVID-19. This may well not be the last pandemic we face in our lifetimes. Climate change may, in fact, be facilitating the propagation of new forms of virus. But I have confidence also in the kind of research that Fulbright and the other exchanges that we organize and that IIE organizes and that we organize with our Finnish universities is creating the research base necessary to create a safe way to return to interacting with one another. I think the human drive to connect and the human drive to interact is stronger. And so while I sympathize with those who fear this is the end of mobility as we know it, and I admit there are days when I've had those dark thoughts myself, I think we all have, if we're honest. At the same time, I believe our drive to connect and our need to interact with one another is stronger, and we ultimately will find us solutions that take us out of our homes in ways that remain safe for us to do so. The next slide. So talk a little bit about what it means to work as a consortium. And at Icep, we like to use the word community. You know, we used to say network, but you can sign up for a network. There are all kinds of networks. You can go online, sign up, pay your dues, and you're a member of a network. But if you're a member of a community, you have a connection and you have a commitment to working with one another. And I think we've really seen the benefits of working collaboratively at Icep in this pandemic. So on the negative side, the most important thing is the loss of actual in-person mobility has led to a loss of diversity on our campuses. The most important impact has been on our mission. But we can't look aside the fact that the exchange imbalances are real. We've had to manage those exchange imbalances. The loss of international student tuition for many of our universities around the world has been a factor. Closure of classrooms and labs. And reprioritizing those labs to the immediate COVID research as opposed to other long-term research projects that remain important, such as the environment and other things. There's been an impact there. And of course, we have students stranded. You know, when the pandemic occurred, we had to move over 1,000 students from one place to another in a matter of weeks. And I don't think our network had ever done that before. We as a community have never faced that challenge. And there were some countries, Morocco is an example, where the decision to close the borders was quick, immediate, and we still have students stranded. However, on the positive side, there's been tremendous resilience by working in a community of universities that many of which, and some of our Finnish universities have been with us for 30 and 40 years. That means that there are strong relationships of trust that pre-exist. Cooperation among universities already is happening at all levels. We were able to create online forum like this and bring everyone together and move quickly to problem solving because that trust and cooperation has pre-existed the pandemic and will continue long after. There's been a sharing of resources. For example, we were able to freeze exchange balances. Some campuses are providing extra support at their expense for students who are stranded and unable to travel. We still have over 250 students in some part of the world that are continuing to remain in their host countries, either by choice or by necessity, and they're being supported by Icep and by their member institutions. And of course, IIE, as always, has resources available for some of the scholars who found themselves in difficult situations. So this collaboration, I think, has been really the hallmark of the Icep consortium, and why I think working in partnership and working as a community is so important. We are going to face some new challenges as a community. A couple of examples of those are, we're going to have to look at academic continuity. We did not ever have really a policy for ensuring that if we had to stop exchanges, we would be able to continue online. And so quickly we had to scramble, and some institutions had resources, some didn't. So we're looking as a community, what kinds of policies might we put in place so in the future we'll be better prepared should we have to stop again for a health crisis or another crisis. Next slide. And I'm going to skip this one a little bit, and we can talk later about what are the short, medium, and long-term approaches. And I want to go to this next question because I'm interested in the few minutes that I have left in talking a little bit about this interest in in contrasting in-person mobility programs with virtual or online exchanges and hybrid. There's a lot of enthusiasm about the virtual world, and I'm excited about technology. We are offering virtual exchanges through Icep, but I remain somewhat skeptical. I want to make sure that at the middle of this, whether you're using a true mobility solution, a virtual one, or a hybrid, where there's some work online and followed by a in-country phase, that at the center of this we have intercultural competence and global learning. And sometimes we get so excited about the technology we forget to think about the goal and the objectives. And so I have some angst that are we really going to see that these virtual solutions and hybrid solutions really deliver the kind of outcomes that we want? If you look at the next slide, what we're thinking about is, make sure the pedagogical model you use, whether you're choosing to use a virtual hybrid or an in-person solution, that you have those outcomes at the heart of your planning, and choose a modality that's best suited to those goals and objectives, that you ask what success looks like and which assessment methods will help us evaluate. We don't have long-term or longitudinal comparisons of what it looks like to do a virtual exchange versus an in-person one. But I suspect we need to do a lot more work before we can simply either say that virtual is going to be the wave of the future and we won't have mobility, or we discount virtual altogether. On the next slide, I offer one example of a rubric. We're not going to look at this. You can go online and look at this is the value rubric from the American Association of Colleges and Universities. But what this illustrates is that, if your goal is to create cultural self-awareness or to increase knowledge of other cultural frameworks, okay, possibly a virtual or a hybrid model might be suited to that. And you could think through ways you might do that. I'm more skeptical about our ability to teach nonverbal communication, empathy, or tolerance of ambiguity through a virtual model, for example. So I suspect when we begin to do more thorough, thoughtful, and long-term studies, we'll find that there is a place for virtual and hybrid models, that they will grow, but that they will each be suited to certain better suited to certain outcomes. If I were to look ahead in 5 years, I think in-person mobility will be strong and robust. I think there's no replacing it. I think virtual and hybrid exchanges will remain with us and get better. And I suspect that each pedagogical model will serve different outcomes effectively. And the last points that I'll make on the next slide is, over the last, I guess, 25 years that I've been in this world of international education exchange, we've shifted our narrative from really a philosophical, idealistic, expand your horizons. In the 70s and 80s when I was a student, and then later when I was first working in this field, it was all about expanding our horizons. We've shifted to a narrative about the purpose ultimately and the outcome ultimately of educational exchange is employability. And IIE's done some wonderful studies on this, as has the British Council and others. That's fantastic. I think we need to be able to demonstrate that students can have a a wonderful career and be active and productive members of society in solving global problems. That's great, but on the last slide I have, I think it's important that we go back in times like this when there's a crisis and focus on the unique ability of educational exchange to help us understand our shared fates as a people, and to expand what I like to call the universe of obligation, this concept from Helen Fine, which is that, you know, in a crisis, we often, our universe of obligation, that universe of people we feel obligated to, we feel connection to, tends to shrink a little bit. And I think our educational exchanges are uniquely positioned to help us resist that tendency to shrink our universe of obligation and rather to expand it so that we begin to see others as intimately connected to us, and that the fate of our country, the fate of our nation is intimately tied to other nations. And so while we think about employability, I think long-term, let's also look at the philosophical and the cultural values of exchange. I think we're going to have to do more advocacy than ever, but I do believe we come out of this crisis stronger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. This really gives us a lot of food for thought for the discussion after the panel. Our next panelist is Dr. Julie Taylor, Director of Academic Relations for Fulbright at IIE. All of us are interested in how US universities are responding, not only in the short term, but also particularly what that might mean for us and transatlantic exchanges in the long term. Is there something that we should particularly pay attention to right now? Julie, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Terhi, and for Fulbright Finland providing this opportunity to discuss a very important topic. So the question that I've been asked is, will the universities in the fall be online, in person, or hybrid? And if you look at the media coverage right now, it sure seems like they're going to be in person. There's been a whole slew of articles, especially since a lot of universities came out at the beginning of May and announced that they were going to be in person. The American Council for Education survey that came out in May, it surveyed 310 university presidents, and 84% of them said that they were very or somewhat likely to return to in-person instruction. And then if you've been following the Chronicle for Higher Education tracking of college plans for the fall, right now they have about 935 universities reporting, and 67% have classified as being in person, 9% hybrid, 8% online, and 16% are undecided. I just want to say something about hybrid because I'm going to refer to it later on. So there's lots of different models for hybrid, but there's sort of two main ones, which is that you'd end up with some of your courses being online, and some of them, especially those that may have a lab component, being in person. And then there's the model that's really growing in popularity called high flex, which gives students the most flexibility, and universities. And in that one, it's multiple modality teaching in which the professor is simultaneously lecturing in person as well as providing an online component. So that way, if students go into quarantine, it doesn't have to disrupt their learning. They can just go online and continue with that. So that's really gaining popularity lately. So there's been this push for, it really seems like there's a trend for going online. If you look more closely though, there are some unusual things going on. None of the Ivy League schools have announced yet. And even Brown, where their president, Christine Paxson, has sort of become the poster child for the movement to go in person in the fall, she has not even announced that her university is going to go have in-person instruction, and she'll probably announce in July. So that made me curious, and I started looking at those universities that might have the greatest independence in making their decision for going online, those with the largest endowments. So I looked at the universities with the largest endowments, the top 15, and of those, none of them have announced, except for 3 of them, and they've said that they're going to do hybrid models, and it's somewhat of a high flex model. The high flex model is also the one that is the most easy to pivot to fully online. So I thought that that was interesting. So what's going on here? Why did we have this huge number of announcements at the beginning of May about in-person instruction? And well, first of all, there's an issue with the data that we're seeing. It's misleading a lot of times, especially the way that it's presented in the media. You want to look at the original sources, and some of it's pretty shoddy. So when IIE came out with its most recent snapshot in May, I found it really interesting that they emphasized that the uncertainty of what was going to happen in the fall. So of their respondents, they said 85% had made no decision. And at the same time, the American Council for Education survey came out, and they're saying that 84% of their respondents are saying that it's likely they're going to be online in the fall. So what's going on there? If you look at it, it's the question that they asked. IIE was asking, have you announced what your plans are for the fall? Whereas the ACE question was much more impressionistic, and the presidents from the universities could sort of say how they were feeling. It wasn't anything where they were being asked, have you made a decision? Have you made a statement? So you have to look closely sometimes at that. And then there's just the more shoddy sources. And I was a little concerned when I was looking at the Chronicle for Higher Education listing a few weeks ago that there was some mischaracterization in university decisions. Last night, I looked in much more detail at it, and it's truly appalling that they have mischaracterized so many of the decisions by universities. Many of the ones that they said were in person are in fact not announcing until July. So I don't know what's going on in that case, but it just goes to show you, we're seeing all this media, so many of them are citing the Chronicle at this point, and so you need to be wary about that. Another reason why we had so many announced in person is that there's frankly very strong pressure for universities to announce that they will have in-person instruction. And well, first of all, there's a bit of wishful thinking going on. I mean, everyone knows you can't really fully fulfill the mission of a university by being online. And so no one really wants to be online. So there's a little bit of that going on. But it's also that at the forefront of everyone's minds, especially the presidents of the universities, it's the enrollment targets. So what happened this year is that normally it would be the beginning of May when they would be receiving the acceptance for students. And most of them extended that window into the summer, and so that they could improve their enrollments. And they're also moving to their waiting lists much more quickly because they're concerned about foreign students not being able to make it to campus and students changing their mind at the last minute. So enrollments really are very important to them. A lot of times we talk about endowed universities. Very few universities have endowments that really matter. 8 universities in the United States hold 20% of the endowment funding, and most of them are enrollment dependent, are tuition dependent. So they have an incentive to announce that they're going to open in the fall in order to keep students from taking competing offers. So that's a pressure that they have. If you're online, you're going to have lower revenues. You'll have lower costs in many ways, but the revenues will be lower. You may not be able to charge full tuition. Right now, there are 25 class action lawsuits involving about 100 universities concerning the tuition from the spring. When they went online, many students felt that they needed to have money refunded to them. And so universities may feel that if they're online, they can't charge the full amount. So that would lower that funding. It dampens their ability to fundraise with alumni. Their alumni are not excited when you say that you're going online. And then they lose the revenue of students being on campus and on-campus housing. There's also political considerations at play. The schools that came out in May, and said they were going to have in-person instruction, many of them were state universities. And the governors have really wanted to show that they're open for business. And they're taxpayer institutions, supported institutions. So of course there's more pressure on them to say that they will be open for business. The federal government is strongly urging universities to open. Last week there was a hearing in Congress, the Senate Health and Education Committee. It's chaired by Lamar Alexander, is a Republican from Tennessee. And he said the question for administrators of 6,000 colleges and universities is not whether to reopen in August, but how to do so safely. So that's definitely the line that's being pushed by the federal government. Also, it was very interesting what was happening at the beginning of May. You had a bunch of schools announce early on that they would have this in-person instruction. It also happened to coincide with a lot of universities having a coordinated effort of lobbying the government for a limited period liability waiver. If they receive this waiver, then they cannot be sued if people come on campus and then, unless there's extreme negligence, they cannot be sued if people come on campus and become sick from COVID-19. It also could provide protections for them if they suddenly have to go online from students continuing these class action lawsuits against them in order to receive tuition reimbursement. So there are those considerations. And then one op-ed was saying, there was also just a strong belief in science, with some perhaps thinking that there would be a vaccine by then, although I doubt that many really felt that way, but definitely thinking that they were going to have the testing capabilities to be able to open in the fall. And now it is more questionable whether or not they're actually going to have the number of tests that they will need. And also it's very costly. One of the reasons why the Cal State schools, the 23 Cal State schools, California state schools, said that they would be going online, they cited that when they estimated how much the testing would be, that it could reach as much as 25 million a week for them to test students on all of their campuses. So that's a kind of frightening proposition. Now, none of this means that they will not be having in-person instruction. It just means that while it looked like we were definitely heading in the direction of in-person instruction, we really don't know much. And you might think, why don't we know much? Because wouldn't the presidents of these universities look kind of foolish for changing their minds? And don't they need a plan if they're going to be reopening? And at a certain point, yes. And that's probably towards the middle of July. Well, they'll really need to commit to something. Right now, they're preparing for anything. But the situation that we have set up right now is what social scientists think of as cheap talk, what's called cheap talk. If you say right now that you're going to open in person, or that you plan this hybrid or high flex option, you can close the university on a dime. We saw that in the spring. It only takes a few days for them to close the university if there was a spike in COVID-19 cases. And a president in this situation would really bear very little responsibility for reversing their decision, because what would likely happen if there was a spike in cases is that there would be a state agency or CDC guidance that would essentially be pulling the plug for their university. It wouldn't be the president making that decision on their own. So one of the reasons why so many presidents are announcing that they'll start in the fall in person is likely because the consequences are pretty minimal at this point for reneging. And then if you compare that to the presidents who announce that they'll go online, they bear full responsibility for that decision. They cannot renege. You can't suddenly open up your university. That takes a lot of planning. So those decisions are highly credible. So what are the things that we would look at to gauge what's happening for the fall? The things that we should look at are the things that the universities are looking at, which are spikes in cases of COVID-19 and CDC guidance. That's probably the main ones. The status of the limited liability waivers. They see this as sort of an existential issue. Many universities are sort of in a very precarious financial situations, and they cannot afford to have these lawsuits. So that's a very important issue. Also, the status of the class action lawsuits. If we start seeing that they're being rejected by the courts or the plaintiffs are losing on these class action cases for the return of tuition funding, then it may give the universities a little more confidence about opening up in the fall. And also the Ivy League and top research school announcements that'll probably be towards the end of June and July. You may see a bunch of other universities sort of bandwagon on those announcements and announce what they are going to be doing. I'd say also the availability and cost of testing. Universities are only now sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of what that will entail. So what does this mean for international students? Many more universities will probably be online by the fall than what we're seeing right now. And so international students might want to see if they can defer their start or if an online start is possible. I think that they should be very flexible because they should expect that universities could change the way that they're teaching at a moment's notice and suddenly revert from in-person instruction to online. And you'd want to make sure that there's a place for you at the university if that happens. So that they would continue to have the on-campus housing be open for international students. So far, that's been the case in most circumstances. But we have an interesting situation happening right now where a bunch of universities are announcing that they're going to open earlier in August, and then they're going to close the university at Thanksgiving because they were afraid of students going off campus and then being exposed to COVID-19 and bringing that back on campus. So they're going to close at Thanksgiving. Some of them are going to just end the semester there. Others are going to have their tests be online, the finals be online. If I was an international student, I would want to make sure that given that there will be a much longer winter break, that there's going to be, housing and services available for them on campus. And if this trend of the university starting early is also something that's a little bit worrisome. So many of them are starting to say they're going to start in early August. And given the situation we have right now with the consulates being closed and the visa situation, that just creates additional pressure in order for them to get the visas in a much shorter window of time. So I think that I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Julie. A lot for us to think about regarding the complexity of the situation on the US side. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions and comments, but before that, we will go to our last panelist to look at Finland's response. And I'm pleased to have with us Birgitta Vuorinen, Deputy Director General from the Finnish Ministry of Education and Culture. As a former board member of our foundation and a tremendous partner for us at the ministry, she's already quite used to me bringing all the tough questions to her. And I'm afraid today's questions again fall into that category. We can already see the immediate impacts of the pandemic and envision a lot of the short-term ones. But how exactly will all of this play out in the long term? How is Finland responding? And how can Finland and Finnish institutions strategically plan their responses to those impacts and changes that are not even known yet? So I'm turning over to Birgitta now, please.
Thank you, Terhi, and good afternoon to everybody, and good afternoon from Helsinki. Giant digital leap, excellence, resilience, flexibility, new normal. There is no going back to the old normal. These are the words probably and thoughts we have all heard. And after March 18th, when COVID-19 lockdown was a reality, the Finnish universities closed their campuses, but that did not, of course, stop teaching and learning or research work. And in Finland, like in other countries, the COVID-19 really reshapes education and is able to do so as well, because our higher education institutions had already started to rethink higher education teaching and learning, not only because of the COVID-19, but because we saw, and the whole Finland saw that there has to be a change. And the Finnish higher education sector has been able to cope with the situation exceptionally well thus far. Of course, there are problems, so everybody is not keeping the pace. There is anxiety. People are very worried about the future and so on. But we can see that our higher education institutions have been able to offer tuition quite well. And the whole Finnish higher education sector, together with our stakeholders and the ministry, formed a vision for 2030 a couple of years ago. And this vision is student-centered, based on student-centered learning and teaching, continuous learning, flexible learning paths, open and online resources, strong pedagogical competence, digital guidance and counseling, artificial intelligence and digitalization in general. And the cooperation between higher education institutions and working life are also of great importance. So this vision launched a process within the Finnish higher education community, and now we can actually thank for that cooperation. University faculty has shown high-level pedagogic competence. They have really stretched to the utmost, and so have our students and rectorates as well. Several rectors have mentioned that the vision for 2030, the nationwide cooperation, and several development projects funded by the ministry have paved the way for this giant leap, as we call it. And the solutions and tools really existed already. So the cooperation, joint targets, national cooperation really matters. Finland sees internationalization as well as immigration of great importance to the whole society. And we have set ambitious goals for the number of international students and staff. And COVID-19 will be a challenge for the Finnish government and the higher education institutions. The competition for international talent will be hard, maybe even aggressive. And international students are even more important to those countries where tuition fees form a great deal of the resources of the higher education institutions, as we just heard. And here again, Finland have joined forces, and several ministries together with the higher education community, business life and stakeholders work together in order to be able to attract and also retain our international talents. This cooperation is called Talent Boost, and we are sure that this cooperation is also valuable for our higher education institutions. So here again, the cooperation matters. Talent Boost cooperation will be used for attracting international talents to Finland, and also finding ways how to interact and integrate international talents to the Finnish society. But English-speaking countries have traditionally attracted the students, even if they are high tuition fees. And Finland charges very modest tuition fees to international students coming outside the European Union. And our higher education institutions have marketed themselves and Finland with a pure nature, safety, with a society that really works. But will this kind of speech work if the pandemic hinders physical mobility, and if traveling to Finland far in the north causes anxiety because of a long flight? So if you are able to travel to Finland, am I making too big carbon dioxide footstep causing global warming when traveling? And if the tuition is online, so how can you really attract international students? So Houston, we have a problem here. Finnish higher education institutions will have a really difficult situation after the lockdown, and also now when they are trying to market themselves to the international talents. Our higher education institutions are trying to tackle the problem with online mobility, hybrid mobility, as was just described by Julie. And they have designed platforms for interaction, developing intensified guidance and counseling, utilizing digital solutions and artificial intelligence. So there is a lot of things going on at the moment, but there is still this question that will this be enough? Because we are a small country, far away from everything, and our beautiful nature and lovely people are not there if you are using the online platforms. But this is something that our higher education institutions are really in the middle of at the moment. It's not in the horizon, on the horizon that the epidemic situation would be much different than it has been this spring. And quite many Finnish higher education institutions have already stated that they will be online in fall. So the next academic year will be different. It will be different for students. It will be different for faculty members alike, and also for the Finnish society in a whole, at whole. And so this is something that we don't really know that what should be done, but there are a lot of discussions going on. In the aftermath of the crisis, new solutions generated by the COVID-19 could be a solution for several challenges. They will offer some answers when it comes to climate change, probably, if you're using online or hybrid mobility forms. This gives a possibility to educate more graduates if you are utilizing the online platforms, and if there is really good guidance and counseling together with very good quality tuition. But I would also like to emphasize the importance of we as a government and as organizations supporting and funding the mobility. So we should also rethink that what kind of mobility, what kind of internationalization do we support? We are now in the middle of discussions concerning Erasmus Plus program, a very important program to all our higher education institutions, supporting physical mobility and supporting internationalization programs and projects. And now there is a time to rethink also all these tools that we use. So what kind of internationalization could be supported and with what kind of tools? Most universities in Finland are still delivering the remaining teaching online in May, and rethinking of opening or reopening their campuses. But like I mentioned, so several Finnish higher education institutions will be online starting from August. The new normal will likely be the future higher education institution sees once the pandemic is over. And turning the crisis into an opportunity is a possibility, and it can happen, but it needs a strong leadership, both at the institutional level, and it needs a strong leadership also at national level. It needs that organizations supporting internationalization and mobility also rethink their operations, and there will be a lot of support needed from our stakeholders as well, so from the working life and different organizations which support internationalization and international mobility. So these were my remarks. Thank you, Terhi and Fulbright Finland, for the possibility to give these remarks. And I'll be happy to answer all the questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Birgitta. And thank you to all of our panelists. I know there are questions and comments waiting to be voiced, so I will now turn it over to Lisa to give us instructions for the Q&A.
Thank you, Terhi. And thank you to our speakers for the insightful remarks. It's great food for thought as we now move into the Q&A discussion. So if you have questions or comments, there are two ways to join the discussion. As you will see, the first option, we already have a few questions from Bill. You can type your question in the Q&A box as yourself or anonymously. The second option is at the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a raise your hand function. You can click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen if you would like to actually speak. And we will unmute you, and then you can ask your question or comment. So please, as you are moved, you can use Q&A or raise hand. So to get the discussion started, please join me in welcoming and inviting an invited discussant. Dr. Pia Bjorn, the Vice Rector of the University of Turku and Chair of the Fulbright Finland Foundation Board of Directors. Pia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Lisa, so much, and thank you for these very insightful and interesting discussions on this important matter. As you know and heard, I'm sitting here with two hats. One is my role as the chair of the board at the Fulbright Finland Foundation, and the other is my role as the vice rector of the University of Turku. And as Birgitta Vuorinen just pointed out, we really are in the middle of a kind of day-to-day situation in trying to figure out how to allow international students and researchers to enter our campus, and on the other hand, it's a day-to-day or even hour-to-hour job to think whether we should or should not send our own researchers and students abroad. At the University of Turku, we have decided that we don't say no, strict no to anyone, but we have recommended that anyone who may should postpone their period in other countries to the beginning of the next year. But as we all know, we don't know how this situation will change. But in the Fulbright context, we recently developed a new form of funding targeted to seeking solutions for global challenges. We actually made the decision on this with the board just before the COVID-19 started to spread. So at the moment, we do have an ongoing call for researchers that will be the ones to really change the world. With this change, I mean change that is based on research knowledge and of outstanding quality. So in addition to thinking about student change exchanges and exchange programs, we also need to think about how this situation will affect doing research work, but we also need to target our research funding tools to the researcher groups who could collaborate in solving and seeking solutions to these really difficult problems. So I think that altogether, we really need to think and rethink the goals for different types of exchanges, whether or not it's about research or studying abroad. And actually, I think that Dr. Lucas, in his talk, thought about this. We really need to think which courses or study packages may be online, which ones may be hybrid, but which need to be in person or in terms of physical mobility. So also Birgitta Vuorinen mentioned that we really need to kind of reset our goals and thinking. And I think, in my viewpoint, I think that we need to continue working in scenario-based way. We have been doing that the whole spring, and we will continue doing that the whole fall, the whole autumn to come. And I think that we might even need to go that as far as kind of integrating the scenario-based thinking in our curricula, in our teaching, in our research, and so on. With these words, I would like to welcome more questions, your comments, and to pose them to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much, and thank you, Terhi and others, for putting this great webinar together.
Thank you so much, Pia. So at this time, I would encourage the panelists to unmute yourself so that you can speak freely during the discussion section. And first of all, I'd like to open it to the panelists. Do you have any thoughts now that you've heard the introductory remarks from each other? You heard from Pia. Does anyone of the panelists want to speak, or any thoughts that you might have at this point before we get into
Lisa, this is Alan. Could I ask Pia and John a question? And that's the role of testing and how at the university and in exchange programs we ought to think about testing our students entering university, at university, or going into mobility programs for research or for study abroad. How should we think about testing?
I think that's a really good question. I think it depends. Again, begin with the end in mind, what the goals and objectives are, right? And so if we're looking at cross-cultural knowledge, skills, and attitudes, I think, it's wonderful when you have tools that cross, a large group of students. So for example, we have things like CERU in California, which is an inventory that all students take rather before and after their college experience, and it allows us to compare those who did and didn't have a mobility experience, what kind of mobility experience, etc. So I think it's really good, and I'd like to see long-term longitudinal studies that compare various learning outcomes for the different modalities, hybrid, virtual, and in person. And that's the kind of thing we would need to work collaboratively among a variety of institutions to get a really rich database to compare those. Because I think then we would get to what Dr. Bjorn was suggesting, this idea of, well, which outcomes are better suited to, hybrid versus virtual versus, in-person mobility programs. So I would certainly like to encourage that type of research collaboration.
Thank you, John. And I want to move here. So we've got 4 questions from participants, and there's one in particular from Bill Eaton. This is a question for Alan and Terhi. For the long term, will we look back to this error as changing our perspective of a 1-year Fulbright grant into being merely the beginning of a multi-year long Zoom cooperation?
Bill, I think it's still too early to tell. I think this period has only reinforced, at least in my mind, the need for deep immersion in other cultures and other societies, living the experience, whether it's teaching or research or a mixture of both. And I think we'll know a lot more a year from now. But a year from now will be Fulbright's 75th anniversary. And the basic model has endured pandemics, conflicts, tensions, and I think it will continue to endure.
Yeah, let me just add from the Fulbright Finland Foundation's perspective. If there's one thing that the lockdown showed us, is that no digital platform, regardless of how advanced, can ever equal real in-person human connection. So the need and urge to meet and dialogue in person to build an understanding and find solutions to challenges really remains at the core of our field. And so I think that's a really important notion here. But we will be working on hybrid models and various types of new ways of developing the programs. So things will look different. But I don't think that we can't forget what the fundamentals of this program is about.
Yeah, and Terhi, that's a really good point, because actually Ed Rosloff, he also has a question kind of along that line. How is the Fulbright goal to increase mutual understanding met through distance education? And he comments, I do not believe the two are compatible. Any other thoughts on this?
Well, perhaps one view that I could throw into the discussion is that it's not either or. If you think about our programs at the Fulbright Finland Foundation, it's always long-term, and we start working with the grantees normally 1 year before their departure, and then they engage with the program for a lifetime after that. And some of the programs may last for a week, others for a full year, but it's much more complex. And they include also online aspects of it. So in a sense, we've been hybrid for quite some time. So that's just something to add to the discussion, I think.
Okay, thank you.
I think an interesting, this is Julie, one thing that's been sort of interesting for us is we've migrated our all of our outreach and recruitment efforts to online is that there actually is more equity in who we're reaching. Because a lot of times when we had things in person, even though people are, are paid to come for these things, there is an accessibility issue, and that we were always concerned about in terms of equity. So there are some benefits to having these things online. But I agree that on the mutual understanding, so much of that comes from the social interaction. And while we're getting very used to having presentations like this online, we're not as used to creating large group social situations. So, having Thanksgiving dinner at somebody's house and seeing how they interact with their family. Experiences like that really add to your international exchange experience. And it'll be interesting to see, we'll really need to be quite creative to simulate some of that if we have to go online for most of these things.
Right, and that's actually kind of goes in line with what Kirsi is talking about. Kirsi, I'm going to allow you to talk since this is really from your perspective. So I'm going to press this button and then you should get a box on your computer that you need to press in order to speak as I unmute you. Kirsi, are you there?
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead with your question and your comment.
I just wanted to sort of continue along with what was just said regarding the enrichment programs. So I'm a Finnish as a Fulbright alumna, and I would say the best part of my Fulbright program in the US were the enrichment programs offered by IIE and One to World. And I think these are extremely important right now. First of all, they introduce different aspects of US society to the students, but also expose us to the perspectives of other students and scholars, also from a wide range of regions, such as the Global South as well. And such dialogues, I think, can be very fundamental for finding sustainable solutions to the pandemic we're having right now and other complex problems. So my question would be, what resources and plans are there to continue enrichment programs and to ensure that they're equally accessible to all?
We agree very much with your perspective, and thanks to the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs of the State Department, these during your Fulbright enrichment activities are considered, I think, very essential. It'll be a little different in the fall, a little different in the spring, a little different in the post-COVID-19 world, but they play a major role and will continue to play a major role and should.
Okay, any other thoughts about that?
We're still planning as many events, but many of them obviously are going to need to be online, and so we're looking at how to enliven those interactions and make it so that the people who are participating can see each other and have more opportunities to speak in small groups in order to create those types of connections as much as possible. Obviously, it's not going to be commensurate with what we had before.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like there's going to be some creative ways of making those connections in this online environment. And I want to pass the microphone over to David Yokin. David, you're going to get a little box on your screen.
It's unmuted. I think you all can hear me. Great.
Yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself, David.
Sure. My name is David Yokin. I'm the Vice Chair of the Fulbright Finland Foundation, and I'm also the Senior Lecturer in Performing Arts and Music at the Turku University of Applied Sciences Arts Academy, where I work very closely with practice-based issues in the arts and community-related issues, and also a lot of international project development. I wanted to thank Dr. Goodman for that very wonderful overview and positive of knowledge for the future, Dr. Lucas for that beautiful concept of network versus community, Dr. Taylor for the very in-depth knowledge-based information of the existing situation in higher education in the States, and of course Brigitte for her presentation from Finland. What I quickly wanted to share was I believe in Brigitte made reference to student-centered learning, and we've been working with this co-creation concept for a long time. So I was very fortunate to be able to go to my digital native students working in this embodied three-dimensional world of performing arts, dance, and music and circus right at the beginning to speak with them to see how they wanted to solve this problem. And I'm very, very pleased to tell you that they created models and ways to work with each other via Zoom and via some other platforms, which was quite natural. Again, this hardly replaces the in-person connection. But there was something that I think for us on the Fulbright board that Dr. Taylor pointed out that we really will speak about during our strategic meeting on June 23rd. And I'm paraphrasing, but you said that there could be last-minute switches from in-person to online teaching this fall. And I think that's going to be something that will be very, very important for us to dialogue with the Fulbright Finnish grantees with their plans going to the States. And finally, with reference to the context of the immediacy that the distant will never replace, I'm a big fan of Wynton Marsalis, and recently on one of his online platforms, he was discussing about the band working distantly, and that's the band of the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. And he said, I'm really missing the bandstand right now and working with my colleagues. So I think that's a very clear concept of what we're all dealing with. This was not so much of a question, but more of a comment. Thank you, everybody, for your time and the privilege of hearing you.
David, it was really nice to hear your voice and observations, and I bet what your students have come up with would be a great best practice to share more widely in the community of fine arts among Fulbright. I am sure they have discovered things that sitting here in New York or Washington we might not have thought of.
Yeah, and I would also like to thank Fulbright because we actually have an ongoing relationship with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, working with a low latency video exchange in performing arts, which we will continue, and that started way before COVID. So the issue of this online environment is very much part of what we're looking at. Thanks so much, Alan.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Alan. So
this is John. I would just thank you again for that. And I think the idea of how to make the virtual better is important because, as Terhi and others have said, it's been a part of what we do for a long time, not to replace, but to enhance. We certainly see this as being very helpful for orientation because, like Fulbright, our students are from all over and you can't always get them together for orientation. And then for our alumni network. Terhi's been advising us on creating an alumni network. And two, while some of those activities are in person and spontaneous and happen in different alumni groups around the world, some of them happen online. So, you know, we look to our visual arts and engineers to help us think through how to make that visual experience more three-dimensional, more realistic, more spontaneous. Because I do think the hybrid has and the virtual has a role in the future, even if it isn't to replace. And so anything we can do to make it better is more than welcome. And we certainly look forward to learning from our visual arts experts on ways we can do that.
Thank you, John. So I'm looking at the clock here, and we have about 10 minutes left. And, you know, I think that we've really discussed kind of the present implications of COVID-19 on higher education and international exchanges, the online, the hybrid. Now, what I'd really like us to do is shift the discussion to the future. So what should we be discussing that is not in the current conversation when we think about higher education and international exchange 5 to 10 years out? And what advice do you have for Fulbright Finland on how to navigate the field generally, and more specifically, the American-Finnish transatlantic context. So I know that's a very large question, but I want to go ahead and give that over to the panelists if you have some thoughts or some advice.
I think the most important thing we can do for the future now is to document what we're doing now, what worked, what didn't work so well, what in retrospect would work better, and to develop a navigation chart that we can have in our map room, desk drawer, to be prepared for the next set of health crises. And one thing that's not happened after every other pandemic is universities and IIE have not developed that documentation, not developed that handbook for what we did, what worked well, what could have worked better. So the importance of not forgetting to document, and then to make a crisis management plan for the future. That's going to be relevant a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now.
Yeah, and Alan, that's a really good point. I heard another webinar that a university leader was saying, you know, this is the true test of our emergency plan. Is it actually working? So now is probably a really good time to evaluate that. And I also think that, Birgitta, did you have some thoughts on this kind of future focused question? Birgitta?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Alan, for very good, very important words. I think I was about to say about the same. So I think that this is really the time when we have to document and also gather good experiences, but also those things that did not go and work so well. We, from the ministry's point of view, we follow, for instance, the credits. So we can see that there are no drastic changes, but that's just numbers, and we ought to go deeper and also try to figure out that what kind of experiences students and mobile students have had, and what has been the quality of online teaching and learning. So we need more statistics, more surveys, more research, and also more opportunities to change views, experiences. And this could be a good starting point from the future plans. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're looking, you know, one of those policies we're looking at is academic continuity. Our crisis management plans have never really included that. And so some universities rapidly moved to a virtual, some gave students options to return home and write papers and deliver by email, but that was very haphazard. Some were quick, some were slow, and in some cases students had to come home and they lost part of their semester because they weren't able to have any continuity. So how could we come together as a community of practice and figure out how to build academic continuity into our crisis management plans ahead of time? And so those are the kind of things. On the insurance side, another policy area, we have plenty of health and safety and repatriation clauses in our insurance for students. We never really had built in insurance for students who might have to quarantine outside of a dormitory in a facility. And that is now something we're adding into our insurance policies for students going forward. So it's, I think Alan makes a tremendously important point that we're also focused on the future, but we need to stop, sit down and take a look back at what's worked and what's not worked, and see if we can come up with some best practices, because this is not the last time we're going to face this kind of a concern.
I'd say that one of the major concerns I have is that whenever we've had recessions or major crises within the academy, it's really exacerbated inequality and inequality within international exchange. And, you know, I think that we often don't recognize that international exchange is a luxury for most of the participants, because we're often focused on the fact that we're providing funding in order for people to have this opportunity. But sometimes we don't see the sacrifices that the students and faculty and institutions are having to make in order to allow people to take those awards. Many times they're having to really contribute financially in order to make this possible, despite the fact that we're providing funding. And I think that if we want to ensure that there doesn't end up being this exacerbation of the inequality on international exchange, we really need to start thinking about that earlier rather than later.
Yeah, so perhaps this is an opportunity to pause and to really look at the accessibility of international exchange. Good point.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and you know, I'm also looking at the clock, so we have about 5 more minutes. You know, as we approach the conclusion, I mean, as we wrap things up, would anyone like to add any concluding thoughts that you've had or takeaways before we hand it over to Terhi for the concluding remarks? Okay, if there's no more thoughts, then thank you all for this thought-provoking discussion. I think that we leave with a lot of food for thought. And now we will end the Q&A discussion and hand it back to Terhi for closing remarks. And I do apologize that we were not able to get to all of the questions, but I want to thank everybody for participating in the Q&A. This was a really insightful discussion. Thank you. Terhi?
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you for facilitating the Q&A. And I want to thank the entire foundation team working on the technical side behind the scenes, making this roundtable possible. And I want to sincerely thank everyone attending today for this comprehensive and thought-provoking conversation. It really gives us a lot to work with, both for the present and as we strategize for the future. I really appreciate the insights to the challenges we face and the potential threats to prepare for too, but also the thoughts that were shared here about ways to turn challenge to opportunity. This roundtable concludes now, but the conversation continues. So on behalf of the Fulbright Finland Foundation, once again, kiitos, thank you for attending.